Well, fortunately, I think the General Assembly recognized that that would be an arduous task. So they actually have in the statute that says any organization that receive tax revenues have to allow us to be a precinct. So as you can imagine, we have several schools. In fact, I would say 40% of our precincts are schools. Then we have another 20, 30% that are places like libraries and park and rec facilities. And then the other 40% really doesn't fall into that category of requiring us to use them by statute, but they are people that generously allow us to vote, like churches. They make up 40%. So what we try to convey to the people is that you are actually providing a community service. You are allowing people to exercise their constitutional right to vote, and also in return, your organization get exposed to over 500,000-600,000 people that are coming in to vote. So we convey the value to them as well as to the Board of Election. And it is a process that, oftentimes people say, you guys, what do you do when you're not voting? And part of those 195, we have GIS maps that we can look at to establish the precinct boundaries. Then we have to go out and locate buildings or organizations that are physically located within those boundaries. So as you can imagine, there are various groups that decide 1 year I want to vote, but depending on what they've experienced or whatever they have going on within their facility, they may decide the next year that they can't vote. So it is an evolving process. One is not the whole same 195 from one election to the other. And the other thing that we try to ensure, as I mentioned, we want to ensure that all voters have access to the voting place. So even when we're not voting, we have people on this team that actually go out and do ADA evaluation, which requires them to visit the physical location, takes measurements, look for objects that are prohibiting the path of a voter when they go to vote, and then making sure that we have adequate parking at those facilities, because we want to make sure that the voters have a place to park. So as you can imagine, from finding those locations, then going in, doing those type of evaluation, it is a long process. So that's what we spend a lot of our time doing when we're not voting. One of the things that we want to ensure, believe it or not, when we're looking at location, the question comes up whether it's a right-hand turn into the parking lot, or whether one has to cross 3 lanes of traffic, whether there's a red light there. And the way we get around those issues is in situations where we do think people will have issues accessing, we provide security or traffic security that will actually, during the highest peak hours of voting, stand there and direct traffic. The place where they're located, as you can imagine, we want voters to vote at locations that they see every day as they're going back and forth to work or to school or to the grocery store. So we look for locations that are on major thoroughfares. So if there are streets that people recognize, and especially, I think we speak a lot about election day, but it becomes very important when it comes to early voting. Because in those situations, you have people that are in early voting, you don't necessarily have to vote at your home precinct. Right. You can vote at any early voting site within the county. Right. So if you live uptown, but you work out in the suburbs, then you can vote while you're working, or vice versa. Right. So we look for large facilities because we know you're going to have a multitude of voters coming from various areas, and we want them to be in the area where people work so that they can go during their lunch break, after work, or before work. Any and everything that we do, it is actually approved and stamped by our Board of Elections board, which is a 5-member board made up of 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. So once we find a location, we will take pictures of that location. We will create a map that identifies exactly where that voting location is on the map, and then we will say the reason that we are moving to that precinct versus another precinct, and we present all that information to our board, and it's up to the board to decide whether that becomes a viable precinct or not. We do, by statute, have to have a Democratic, a Republican, and a chief judge. And there are even criteria around that. You can have not more than 2 from the same party, which tells you you must have a mixture. Right. But I would say the process starts with what we call a forecast. So from an equity standpoint, we want to make sure that all our precincts, based on the number of registered voters within that precinct, have the most effective and efficient election that they can have. Right. So we run an algorithm that says for 100,000 registered voters within that precinct, what is the expected turnout? Right. And based on that expected turnout, we decide, in addition to the chief judges, how many other assistants do we need in that precinct, as well as how many voting machines that we need in that precinct, because we want to make sure that they all are equitable. So any given election, depending on the size, in addition to those 600 judges that you referenced, we can have anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 additional poll workers that we have to recruit and train for any given election. Well, I would say that we're also fortunate to have people in this county that recognize the value of the process and want to participate. So it doesn't become so much of trying to convince them, but it's a matter of making the tools available for them. So we have on our website, we have an application. If someone is interested in becoming a poll worker, they can go out to the website, mecboe.gov, and it will explain every position that is actually available. So that's one. And usually that happens from people, friends and families. They will see someone voting since it's within their precinct, and they say, whoa, what do I need to do in order to vote at that precinct? And they say, oh, go to this website. In addition to that, at every election, we have what we have called a sign-up sheet, where when a person goes to the poll book and they're looking for their name in the poll book, there's a sheet that says, do you want to work? An opportune time for them to be looking around, see what is going on, and say, oh, I'd like to do that. So with that sign-up sheet, they're able to do that. Then there are situations where we have what we call info sessions. That's where we will hold a session here at the Board of Election. We will publish it on our website and in other media, and people can actually come to the Board of Election where we will tell them any and everything they ever wanted to know about voting, as well as the Board of Election, and we can explain that process. They will sign up for various positions there. We will have an interview session with them, one-on-one, before they leave that day, to answer any and all questions that they may have. Our hope is once they leave one of those info sessions, that they know everything that they need to know to make the decision on whether they want to work at the polls. The night before the election, we do what we call setup. Because certainly we don't want people to arrive and be faced with the task of setting up equipment, putting out signs, organizing the precinct. So that's why we call it a setup day, the night before. And that setup day and time is usually based on when the people in that precinct that are volunteered to vote are available. Some say the most available time for them is noon, others 2 p.m., others 3 and 6. So we understand what are the various times that they are available. We arrange with those precincts to offer their facilities for setup. So when the judge and the poll workers show up on election day, their main task is one of putting out signs. The equipment has already been set up. They've already organized their tables. And now it's a matter of putting up signs that people that are passing by understand the access to their precinct. And when they come in that morning, they are starting up the machines, making sure that they've calibrated the night before, and making sure they're ready to go for the first voter. That's why we say 5:45. We want to give them at least, I would say, 45 minutes, because the polls will open up at 6:30, and we don't have a choice in that. At 6:30, they definitely have to open. I think the main thing is training to start off with. And I'm going to say even training of our trainers, because our trainers have to understand what are the changes in laws for that particular year, have to understand the statutes. So the State Board of Election have huddle sessions. They have sessions where they will call in the trainers to say, these are the changes in our statutes or in our voting criteria. These are the new documents that you have to use. So when our poll worker trainers go in to train the poll workers, they're conveying information that they have received themselves. So we have different trainings for whatever position you have agreed to work. If you agreed to work on the computers, we have computer training. If you have signed up to be an equipment assistant where the voters are actually placed, we have that training. And then we have the general assistants, where people are either poll book assistants or sitting at the information desk when people come in. So all of that is training. As you can imagine, you only have a 1 to 2 hour training, so there's an additional training for the judges, because the judges are accountable and responsible for what happened in the precinct. So all of the other poll workers have at their disposal 3 judges that they can always go to if there's anything that they feel that they need to know that wasn't provided in their training or they didn't understand. In addition to that, we have what we call hotlines here at the Board of Election. A judge, any and every question that they need to know, they can call the voter registration hotline, they can call the front desk, or they can even call precinct management. We have a hotline. So we have that support structure where someone is going to know the right answer. So you don't necessarily have to feel as a poll worker, I need to know everything, because you have other people that you can go to get the answers. A person can think that they are registered to vote. A person can think that they are qualified to vote for certain candidates. They can think that they can go to any precinct that they want to go to. But that is not the case. Based on your voter registration, the area that you're located in, there's a certain precinct that you go to vote in election day. There's also a certain list of candidates or ballot styles that they may get. And then there's also the idea of being registered to vote. However, if someone have not researched and know everything that it is about that precinct, whether they are qualified to vote, they may come in thinking that they can vote, and a judge may go through the whole process to explain to them why they can't vote. If they're in the wrong precinct, we do have a process called a transfer where we can direct them to the other precinct. But even then, if a person says, no, I don't want to go to that other precinct, that's what you mean about we never turn anyone away. Right. And we will tell the person, these are not the candidates that you are qualified to vote for. This is not the precinct. But you can vote provisionally. And a provisional ballot, that becomes a paper ballot where, and the reason it is a paper ballot is because on the express vote, once you cast your vote, once you make your selections, take it over to the DS200 or the ballot tabulator, then those votes are included with all of the votes to be counted for that election. Right. However, a provisional ballot is one that is brought back to the Board of Election. Voters registration will actually do an assessment on their provisional ballot to determine if that person is qualified to vote for the candidates that they voted for within the precinct that they're voted at, or even for the elections that they wanted to vote. For election day, the precinct boundaries are predetermined. And they are predetermined because it's strategically located for where people live. We sort of follow that same concept for early voting. It is a board decision, but the board decides strategically where do they want to have those voting sites located within the county. You want to have X number of north, south, west, east, in various populations. Some you want to have more than one in a location given the number of people that are actually located there. So it's a pretty determined process where the board really takes that process very seriously. They will sit down and take a look at the map and say, where are the population centers within the county? And based on the expected turnout of the election, we can have anywhere from 10 to 30 early voting sites depending on the selection. And we're also looking for areas where the people are located. So if our population is uptown, where people come in the inner city to vote, we want to have one there. If we have someone down in the south area where they're out shopping, we want to have it there. Up in the university area, around the university, we want to have an early voting site there. So they are pretty strategic in determining where those early voting sites are going to be located, as well as how many early voting sites there are. Because it's really, and you also look at history to say people that are, say, up in Huntersville, those that are traveling down in the city, that they vote in the city or did they vote up in Huntersville? Right. And I think the last study we found out that the majority of them actually voted within their home area. Exactly. So that will tell you that you really want to have a presence there in addition to one in the inner city. And that is a testament to the organizations that are within the city. We didn't have to go out and convince them that this was going to be a large presidential election. We didn't have to convince them that we were operating in a COVID environment. So they themselves recognize that we have these large facilities. We can create an environment where we can be safe, we can be secure, and we can also offer an area where people are actually located, they can come in and vote. And that actually makes our job a lot easier. When you're looking for these large sites, like large empty box stores, right, or a shopping center or office buildings, in those situations, you have to convince the landlords of the value in it. You have to convince the landlord that we're not going to keep them for renting the place or leasing the place out while we are voting. So those become a harder sales than the Bank of America's or the Charlotte Hornets. Those organizations themselves offered up their facilities, and they made all type of adjustment for us to vote there. It was just, as you can imagine, if you go into Bank of America, we cannot locate voting machines on the 50-yard line of the Panther show because we have certain criteria. So there was office space, there were corridors within the facility that they actually secured and allowed us to vote at. We have this process that we call chain of custody. So once the voting equipment is actually programmed out of our warehouse, they place a seal on several different areas of the voting equipment. For the tabulator, there's a seal on the storage where the flash drive is. There's a seal on the actual computer portion of it, and then there's a seal on the ballot box itself. Right. So when it leaves the warehouse, those are recorded on a sheet that says these are the serial numbers of the machines that are programmed for that site or that precinct. And during setup, one of the first things that we do, and we train our workers to do this, is when that equipment is moved from the storage area onto the voting enclosure, you look for the serial number to make sure that it's the same that was scheduled to go to that particular location. Then you open up the machine, you look for the vote count. The vote count, if it was 0 when it left the warehouse, it's 0 then. And the last part of the security is once the voters start voting on that equipment, that seal with the flash drive that is actually recording the vote is never broken until that flash drive is ready to come back to the Board of Elections to be counted in the overall election results. So we're very diligent in assuring that however the machine is programmed is the way that it arrives at the site and is the way it is actually placed out on the voting enclosure and then further to come back to the election. That's the way we ensure that those machines are secure. If we're dealing with the early voting site,
right.
which is a 17-day process,
Right.
there's a shutdown process each and every night where we tabulate the number of votes that's on the machine. And then when we come back in, then that particular area is actually locked so that no one can enter the voting enclosure. And the first thing that we do in the morning when we arrive, open it up, look for the ballot count to ensure it's the same as it was the night before when we left.
Exactly.
And then on election day, they do that same thing, but they only have to do it once, and that's for that election day. So that becomes the difference. We do it 17 times during early voting, and then on election day, we're doing it at setup, and then when we start up in the morning.